find the right people to help you build it.
So when you're finding the right people, I think I'll go back to the conversation we just had before we started here.
Yeah.
You say you broke open a piece of hardware and said, like, oh wow, this is not optimized. It works, it's sold very well, but it's not optimized the way you could if they had a lot more staff on board.
Yeah.
So when you're hiring, where do you draw the line and say, we have this minimum viable product, not optimized at all, but it's something that appeals to consumers with its current functionality. Yeah. We could hire on, team up, and solve these problems and shrink it to half. Does that make sense? When do you go with? Do you just go with that minimum viable? I mean, this one obviously was successful.
Yeah.
But where do you draw that line for yourself? Where do you see that line should be drawn?
Yeah. So I'm going to suggest that minimum viable in the wearable space is going to change pretty dramatically, really fast. So devices like Pebble managed to sell, right? Here's the reality. Motorola said, we're going to go build a wearable device on your wrist. And set aside whether or not you're going to buy a 360, it's got a fucking circular display on it. These things don't exist, right? So companies at the scale of Motorola can build fabs to build these things. So if you're building a device with a little display on it, all of a sudden the crappy e-paper or e-ink display that you were able to get from a vendor last year isn't good enough, because all the things in all the shelves are going to be really awesome bits of hardware from guys like Samsung and Motorola and people like that. So I think there was a really big surge in companies before that could get away with minimum viable. I think that's changing very, very rapidly. So I think I'd be much more cautious about taking that path, just in general.
There are components like displays that are difficult to obtain for a small company like that. But you'd be surprised that even some of the companies that have been named up just in the last 30 seconds, who they call when they want to get things. Just because you're big doesn't mean your budgets are infinite. And it's circular displays. I challenge all those of you who open up that circular display and see what silicon's behind that. You'll be surprised.
So given that just you foresee a landscape where minimum viable product is no longer viable, I mean, can these smaller wearable companies can be just at speed they can move compared to a Motorola who they can't be a year out just making as fast a movement as I think our audience probably can? Or is it trying to go and do things that are disruptive enough that they just don't rely on having the latest hardware inside of them?
Yeah, so I think the big thing is going to be just actually differentiating on some combination of software and services and or actual core technology. So as an example, all of the fitness wearables today are mostly the same, right? There's a battery, there's a radio, there's an accelerometer. That's it, right? And occasionally there's an optical heart rate sensor or something like that. So why did Intel just go spend north of $100 million to buy Basis, right? It wasn't because the Basis is a beautiful device that everyone wants on their wrist. And it's not because they were yet another maker of accelerometers on your wrist. It was, wow, these guys have really cool sensor technology that can measure a bunch of things that nobody else can. So we're going to make a big bet on that, right? Look at Apple, right? Everyone keeps talking about Apple's going to build an iWatch and it's going to be beautiful and all those other things. What's really interesting is look who Apple's been hiring, right? The guy that runs their health stuff came from a company called Masimo. They build medical grade sensors. They acquired a company that does non-invasive, or tries to do non-invasive optical glucose monitoring, right? So all of these companies are saying, look, it's not just about ID, it's not just about sort of building Me Too devices. It's either innovation on the software and services side, or it's hardcore innovation on sensor technology. So I think that's probably the path forward, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree on the sensor side of the business. It's really kind of interesting. 10 years ago, I got into the wearable business when I actually had 4 daughters, and I decided I got tired of getting up in the middle of the night and seeing when they had a fever when the sicknesses were going around. So I actually built being a nerd engineer, I actually went out and built a little device, temperature sensor that I could stick to my daughter and put in the battery, and had a little base station up by her crib, and I could transfer the data up to the base station, then over to my room. Actually built, works, and if you don't believe me, Cypress Semiconductor has the app notes on how to do it. But of course it never went commercial for a lot of the reasons that we are going to commercial today, and this is why it's so exciting. I mean, the battery technology has improved so much. It's incredible. The power has come out of the RF that allows us to actually battery power RF. And before, you just have to have massive batteries there. It just wouldn't work. And then, of course, the different processor sizes have gotten so small that it's really amazing. So you can make things incredibly thin. So while there's a lot of view that only differentiation can come through software and stuff like that, once again, my company makes the world's thinnest semiconductor chips, 0.27 millimeters thick, if you can believe it. And what's so critical here to understand is we're providing access to technology that you cannot access usually unless you were a big company. That is the game changer that's going on, is you actually can make things that are as small as you can believe, as small as Apple and the Motorola's and the Samsungs and these kinds of companies. And what's ironic is time to market is driving this. It isn't just what is the best technology out there, but how fast can you bring that best technology to market and how quickly you can do it. There's a really reason, once again, when technologies are this compelling, why people suck it up in such large volumes.
So one question I have is, how small are we going to go and what are we coming up against there in a limiting factor? I think both for wearables now, like what are the major constraints if you want to shrink down? And then what are we going to be coming up against in the next few years as we keep trying to go smaller, component limitations there?
On the component side, what you are starting to run into some just physical properties of just how small can you build things. For example, most of, on the manufacturing side, you physically cannot cost effectively build your electrical connections any smaller than 0.4 millimeters on a pin size. Now, can you do that? Yeah, you could do it if you want to pay just massive amounts of money. But the practical matter, if you go over to Asia, as I agree, almost everybody does, that's the kind of a practical limit. So even if we made our dies any smaller, you're really not going to buy a whole lot. So you're starting to run up against some manufacturing limits of just how small can you make things. On the size limits, we've cracked the, you can be, on the Z limit, you can be incredibly thin now, so thin that you can barely see it. We can show you back at one of our tables the world's thinnest semiconductor at 0.27 millimeters thick in plastic. Unbelievable. And there are things now happening where we can now embed sensors right onto the silicon itself for very cost effectively, and we're starting to now get into that kind of things. So I think this has got a long, long, long way to run in terms of how small things are going to be. And you might even be just limited by the battery size, you know, maybe some things like that would be more the limitation.
Yeah, I guess laws of physics, right? There's a really cool company in Boston called MC10, and what they do is build flexible, printable semiconductors. They can build a tattoo that sits on your body and measures your heart rate and all sorts of other parameters, right? So there's really crazy stuff being done.
Right. It seems like we're coming up to the point where there's kind of the two paths of you can be really competitive with hardware, which is just going to become a lot harder as the bigger players come in, or you can be competitive on services. So at what point in just making my prototypes, doing my wearable startup, where do I prioritize service first and then find the hardware that comes after, hardware first, find services that integrate with that? And what stage should I have my services locked? Can I manufacture first? Should I wait a long time before I manufacture and have services completely locked?
So I don't know about the getting software or services or product right. I would start with the what is the thing that makes someone go, holy God, I want that thing, right? And it's probably a combination of both. One thing to think about though with software and services is you can distribute them and get market awareness of them and adoption of them way faster than software, or hardware rather. So pop by the Best Buy on Harrison in San Francisco. There is a section that basically Samsung owns, right? When Samsung builds a wearable, they can give 1, 2, or 2 or 3 to every store so they can actually have people trained on it. So when you're in this world with physical devices, and this market becomes more and more real, remember that there's a ton of channel dollars and ad dollars that like we as startups don't have. And so the place where we're going to lose is on the shelves versus Samsung, because we just can't afford the shelf space. Like, it's really that simple. But you can get people to use your software, and you can get people to screw around with apps and all sorts of other things, which are going to drive awareness and adoption of your stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You gotta, as a marketing guy, you gotta have the wow factor. The world is very jaundiced about kind of things that don't have a wow factor. So you really, really got to have something that adds value. And I think wearables are going to get a lot more nichier over time. I think it's going to be a lot tougher to just kind of go compete with the Samsungs and Motorola's of the world, no doubt about it. So I think, but the niches are massive, and there's so many of them that I think there's going to be a lot of areas. But I think more and more people are going to have to think in terms of niches. I mean, you see the motorcycle helmet back there that I just think is cooler than anything. And sometimes it's a hardware play, sometimes it's a software play. When you're as far as the hard, tough part of it. You know, if you have something as big as a motorcycle helmet, maybe you've got a little more room to put things in. Small size isn't at the end of the world. But if you're trying to do something, you know, like a little wristwatch or something like that, and you want to be the world's thinnest, then maybe hardware is actually the critical thing that you're working on in terms of the tough problems.
Where do you think the line should be for wearables? I think there's kind of two. One is the wearable that's really obvious and that you're showing off and that is sexy and fun. The other is the one that you just want to completely disappear. Are those two different breeds of wearable, or do you think that we will eventually center on one and say we want something that completely disappears and the service is the only thing that's left?
I don't know. There are things that I wear that are for fashion, and there's things that I wear that are like comfortable and when I'm at home, right? Like I think the spectrum of things you're going to want devices to do are going to range from things where they need to have an interface, and so they need to be visible, and there's going to be things where they don't need an interface, and you probably prefer them to be perfectly invisible, right? So like I am never going to wear glass and walk down the street for fear of being thought of someone that would wear glass and walk down the street. But I could pop a tiny little Her-style headphone piece into my ears, and you wouldn't see it at all. And it could whisper into my ears, hey, you're about to be late for a meeting, hey, you're about to do these different things. And so I would think about what are the things that you're measuring if it's a sensing device, and does that thing need to be visible or not? And then what's the interface that the user actually needs? Like, do they need to see it? Do they need to feel it? Do they need to hear it? Or can it be invisible? And then the final part is just sort of emotion and affect, right? Is this something that I care about? Because if I see it and I feel it and I touch it and it's beautiful, like I'm going to care about it and think about it. If it's not, I'm not, right? And that's fine for some class of devices. So I think it comes down to just what is the thing that you're building, and what interaction with the user do you need?
I generally agree with that comment. I don't have a tremendous amount to add there, but in terms of, I think rather than visible or invisible, I would say how just like I was giving my story about when I made my own wearable more than a decade ago, how invasive is it on a person? And you know, if you're on a medical device or something like that, you want to be very non-invasive in any sense. You don't want somebody rolling over and, you know, even feeling a coin cell or lithium ion, and what are the safety implications and all that kind of thing. So, and does it matter to be visible? I would argue the case that sometimes you want things that are visible. I think one of the reasons Apple did so well in some of their cases precisely because their products were visible, and people go, well, what's that? And that becomes its own advertising in a case where if you made something amazing and it was invisible, people wouldn't know to ask what that was. And word of mouth is one of the best forms of advertising out there.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, my jawbone is basically visible from space, right? It's light. But you can imagine that I have another device in my pocket, which is a low-power RF thing that just authenticates me to my computer magically. I don't need to see it, hear it, think about it. In fact, I'd rather nobody see it, hear it, think about it, because it's an authentication device, right? So I think that's how I think of it, splitting invisible or not.
Speaking of never seeing or thinking about something, I think one of the big choices you're facing when making wearables is, do you want to plug it in or not? Is it battery powered and has a transmitter, or plugs in at some point? What do you use to judge that? When do you go for the bulkiness, or what are your metrics there?
If you have a device that has to be charged and it has to be charged frequently, it has to be really, 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 really important, right? Like it's one of these. We talk about like in building software and services that you earn the right to have someone's attention. Having a device that requires any sort of action like charging is something that you earn the right to do. So if it's super valuable, sure, I'll charge it every day. I would never charge my jawbone every day, but like once a week, yeah, that's fine. Like that's a reasonable cycle. My phone, every day, right? And like you can make the phone battery life better and better and better. It's sufficiently important to me that it's going to get charged every day.
Power is one of those critical factors. There's basically three ways to put power into a device. There's the wire, there's magnetic, and there's light. Nothing beats a wire today, unfortunately. I mean, it's just really efficient. A lot of people are thinking, well, we're going to put magnetics into cell phones and things like that. But it's just, you know, the more the power comes up in terms of processing power, and the more we want to suck batteries, I kind of think for larger devices, that's just not a very good way to go. And then we try to put magnetics into really tiny devices, and the problems you get, you start to run into physics problems, where your inductors get so small that you have to go at very high frequencies, and you got a lot of heat buildup and things like that if you want to transfer any kind of real power. And people are going to demand faster and faster charging, and the battery manufacturers are starting to respond on that side, which is pretty exciting. But once again, that means you need to put a lot more amps through things, and so that moves you away from magnetics a little bit. But then, you know, wires take connectors, which are nasty too. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Silego looked into a bunch of light charging, where we actually didn't rely just on sunlight, but because sunlight obviously isn't around at nighttime when a lot of people could take the time to charge. We actually looked up, you know, what can an incandescent bulb do, what can an LED bulb do, and we got some really good results just off of LEDs and some you know, silicon solar panels and some gas solar panels and things like that for really small wearables. I think that technology is going to be limited to somewhere around, you know, 100, 150 milliamp hour kind of batteries, and magnetics can probably go a little bit higher than that. And then I think once you start going over an amp hour batteries and stuff like that, it's still wire is far and away the best. And there's all different kinds of considerations you need to think about when you make that decision.
Great. I want to circle back around for a second. You mentioned earlier that minimum viable product is going to change, and that will become more, you think, much more difficult to get to. When does that change happen? Do you have an idea? Is there a sea change coming? I mean, looking at, you know, I'm building Wearable right now. Should I just rush to get it out while there's still the expectation that this, something that's more cobbled together can work? Or should I just set aside time to go and really try to get a more refined piece of hardware?
I mean, I think it depends on what you're building and for whom, right? If you're building a consumer device that you think is akin to a piece of fashion, then you should probably get it right. There's a lot of people with a lot of money that are building really beautiful devices and have the money to spend on really expensive manufacturing processes that you probably don't, right? And so that's really important. If you're building an enterprise device that's, you know, helping authenticate people in the enterprise or things like that, probably doesn't matter, right? You're solving an important enough pain. I think that the challenge with the consumer wearable stuff is we're a whole bunch of people that aren't really used to building fashionable devices, and now we're building fashionable devices. And the reason that not many people have wearables is because we've failed pretty catastrophically at building devices that are beautiful, right? And so as companies like Samsung and Apple and Nike and the rest of them that have huge ID teams and can afford manufacturing processes that, again, you just can't, whether or not you get the chips, you know, I think that's going to drive the consumer side. If you're not building stuff for consumers, it's very different.
So I guess we see some of the other side. We see people, I think one of the big benefits of crowdfunding is that you can test, is this idea good enough? And so I think we certainly see people who test, is there a what's the tolerance for non-beautiful? And that might be a question. If it's functional, that'll work. Do you think that beauty is where we're headed? Or I think there's, as you mentioned, the enterprise space, but is there a consumer space where there's still, if you're solving a deep enough problem, people just absolutely will not care if it's the ugliest thing they've ever seen? Or is the access to beauty by these major players just going to be a big market pressure that's going to push that back?
So, please don't think I'm ragging on Pebble. I actually love the device. But Pebble's kind of an ugly device, and it's kind of poorly made relative to any wristwatch anyone's ever purchased. And yet it was ridiculously successful in crowdfunding. So was that because there's huge consumer demand for it, or is it because there's a whole bunch of nerds and we can spend a bunch of money to buy devices that are kind of neat? So I think reading into the pre-sales numbers for a lot of these devices is very dangerous, because sure, a whole lot of us are going to go, wow, that's really cool. It's a display that talks to my phone. It's $150. Sure, here's my credit card. Getting my wife or mother to buy that is a completely separate other issue.
Yeah, I would say on the one thing is, depending on how much money you have, every market has its own challenges. I mean, if you're going into an enterprise market, good luck even getting on the AVL. You could have the best product in the world. You walk into Cisco and the component manufacturer looks at you and go, sorry, you're not coming in here. So every business has its challenges. And one thing that I think in terms of startups, and I've had 2 successful startups under my belt, is it always takes a little bit longer. It's always a little more work. Make sure you have double the amount of money you're thinking about. And this type of thing, and keep patient and grind it out, and good things will happen. But you've got to keep very sane and listen to your customer base very closely. In terms of ugliness and beauty, I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder, but people just don't tolerate. One of the things that's changed a lot, and I think in the last 5 years, and in large part because of Apple, is people don't have a tolerance for bad quality anymore. It no longer is it a race to the bottom in price, and you slap together a poor Dell or poor HP product, and you go buy it, and you know it's going to go bad in a couple, 2-3 years, and you throw it away and buy a new one. That's not there. I mean, if an iPhone goes bad or one of these things, people go and demand a refund. You know, they're not going to sit side. So you've got to build good stuff if you want to stay there. Now, I mean, if your whole business is to go get bought out by somebody, I don't know that business. That's not how I run my businesses. I run my businesses for the long term. I don't make short-term kind of thoughts of how can I be attractive to buyout. Now, that may be a viable in other people. I'm not casting any dispersions on any of that business model, but that if you want to build a company for the long term, you got to build high quality. Like my company, I'll just give you an example of quality. We have one failure at 15 million units. That's our quality. Just kind of give you an idea.
So I think one of the challenges when you are prototyping, going through that, is that you can't really get your gorgeous prototype into user testing. I have my, my giant prototype, or maybe your smaller prototype.
Yeah, we don't do giant prototypes over here.
But how do you? Is there a way to test for beauty? I mean, as you're working towards, you can say what looks good. But when I'm testing my early prototype, am I just testing functionality, or should I always be testing for beauty and always testing for aesthetic, and just assume that I will try to get this form factor to eventually meet my functional prototype?
I mean, it depends on the product you're building, right? Like, if you're building something that's going to be visible on my body and visible to a whole lot of other people, and it's meant to be fashionable, then test for beauty, test for fit, right? I mean, Apple is famous for the ID team builds the shell of whatever it is they're making, and then the poor bastards in engineering just need to make everything fit. Samsung doesn't do that, and that's why the devices look the way they do, right? So both work. Like, Samsung's clearly a ridiculously successful company, but if you want to build beautiful things that you're willing to sort of show off on your body, you should probably start with designing for beauty.
I agree, and there's this recurring theme of large prototypes. Trust me, the big companies are not starting with massive prototypes and shrinking. It starts with the first prototype, looks a whole lot like the final product. It really, really does.
Are there any questions from the audience? I think we'd love to. No? Non-quizzical? Yes?
Sure. So when you have a small team and you're starting to venture into areas where your team maybe doesn't have expertise, you're faced with the option of recruiting experts in those fields or talking to vendors that maybe have modules that do it. I'm curious with any advice you have on what choice you make in those cases.
So you've got the component vendor and the entrepreneur. All right, so the entrepreneur says team trumps everything else. I would never trust my vendor to tell me how to build things because they have they might be the most trustworthy people in the world, but they have an agenda. So like when I go and call guys at TI, I call them with people that know what they're talking about so they can have a meaningful conversation. So I think you have to do both. I think it's one of these things where hardware is yet another more complex situation, and it's one of these places where you just need to raise more capital so you can afford to have a team that's able to sort of have your interests at heart.
I actually agree. A team is absolutely critical. There's only one way to come up a learning curve quickly, and that's by hiring the right person. I mean, the way I look at it, when I hire in, and once again, I build a lot of teams around the world. When I hire in, I don't expect an engineer who's new at something to become a world expert in under 24 months, no matter how bright that person is. They start making good decisions maybe 3, 4, 5 months into the life, but to become a world expert, you got to be, you're out a couple of years, and the only way to short circuit that is to hire the right person that's actually been there and done that. And there's so many little niggly kinds of things. You don't get bit by the big concept. Most of you guys are probably great at big concepts, but you get bit, like I was talking about, because you put in a little inductor and now it's overheating and you're going, oh crap. And now you've got 3, 4, 5 month delay in your project over just some little peanut kind of thing. You've got a MOSFET in there that's burning too much power and its RDS on is 40 milliohms, and you got a software guy trying to figure that out. you know, and I would say rely on your vendors a little bit, not from the trust standpoint in reference to what I said, but they've got a pile of information, and if you get 2 or 3 vendors walking in there, you can kind of come up to speed pretty quick if you go poll a number of different people to kind of see what the solutions are. You would be shocked at how apps engineers really work their tail off in semiconductor companies. And I don't just mean that at Silego, I mean that across the industry. But yeah, do your own homework, but they're a great resource.
And I will just add on, as having seen a lot of people go through this process, anything you do on team, that's institutional learning that you have moving forward. If you don't outsource something and they learn something extremely insightful about your business, what you're doing, something that will help you moving forward, and they're not around next time that comes up, that's also around. In the back, yes?
Seems like on wearables or any type of small technology, it's always the battery, it's always the power.
Do you see any big changes in battery technology coming down the road? Everybody's always announcing they have a new cathode, they have a new anode, it's going to be 10 times better, have 10 times as much power, but it never seems to reach the market.
I mean, I'm curious what you guys think. I've not seen anything particularly interesting or new in chemistry on battery side in quite a while, right? Batteries are like the one thing that grossly underpays Moore's Law and have done forever.
Yeah, what I see is a lot of marginality kind of stuff, nothing that's earth-shaking. I see things that can discharge a lot faster in lithium-ion. I see you can charge them a little higher and get another 10–15% out of your battery this way. Some of the batteries now are getting a lot better over temperature, things like that. But I don't, to your point, I don't see anything that's like, 50% better over here or anything that's truly. But lithium-ion, you got to remember, that was a huge step forward. The only reason this room is together today is because of lithium-ion technology hitting the mainstream, and that's why we have a room here today. Because, like I said, I would have been on this 10 years ago if I had production volumes of that kind of stuff. The one things that are changing is the battery charging technology is getting a little better. USB's coming out with little flippable connectors and things like that that are pretty interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the connectors like micro USB. Micro USB is fucking huge if you look at it. It seems to
That's
be
right.
a lot of waste.
Well, come talk to me about a light charger. How big is your battery?
Like 80 million.
Yeah, so you might be able to put a little solar panel on that. You put a nice little light source on a gas solar panel, and you can charge that baby up no problem. I've got a demo. I can go back and see my computer, and I'll show you how to charge it. And that way, now you've got a panel that's literally 150 microns thick, and you can charge it up all day long.
Yeah, because that's the problem. That was really insightful when you were talking about the connectors, the physical connectors.
Yeah.
And inductive.
That's right.
I hadn't thought about light.
Yeah. Well, you can do it. It's there. Now, I grant it's not going to be competitive over about 150 milliamp hours, though.
Is the successor to the micro USB the new reverse connector? Is that materially smaller?
Yeah, well, it is. It's definitely smaller. Yeah, and one of the problems that you have is you got to, we're all, the United States average age population get a little older, and you get your connector too small, and you can't flip it around, then you can't even figure out which side. You're just jamming it, right? So having to flip up the connector is really useful when they get really small.
Got the jitterbug adapter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, third question in a row.
Well, and the same thing, lasers are the most powerful light sources. Is anybody doing?
And we kept away from, in my research, and once again, we didn't productize this, although it's very, very simple to do. You actually don't need a semiconductor company to do it. That's one of the reasons we didn't productize it. It's kind of like when a drug company finds out aspirin does something nice, they kind of like, oh yeah. Light charging was like that with us. So, at any rate, or what was the question again? I shouldn't go off on tangents. Oh, lasers. Yeah, lasers are dangerous in terms of the consumer. So I did a cursory look at lasers, and the problem is even with the light source, you have all kinds of specs on what safety is and what bandwidth you can have and where you need to have your light source. And if you're at a laser, you have to have, you're probably going to burn a bunch of money in terms of what is the container to allow you to charge on a light. But could you use a laser? You could, and I don't know what your cost budget are, but your cost will go up a lot, a huge amount.
Was there a question in the back?
I just have a question about you guys see interface
You mean like the Google Now kind of feature? Or even more complex?
So the way that we used to think about interfaces was primarily a bitmap display of some sort, right? So I throw a bunch of pixels at you. And then for a long time, people thought voice was going to be the next big thing, and it turns out we can type faster than we can speak often and stuff like that. So that wasn't really the solution. I would think about interfaces in a very, very different way, which is what's my core service, and what are the different touch points someone might have with it. So if I'm walking down the street saying, okay, Google, give me directions to X, works great. Like, voice is the right interface. When I'm at my desk and there's a notification, don't say anything, just pop the screen up, especially if you know the screen is oriented upwards, right? Just pop it up on the screen. If I'm in the car, use CarPlay or whatever the interface is to pop it onto the center console display, right? So I think, and that list is going to expand, right? We're going to use things like Chromecast and Apple TV to push the interface to your television and the living room as well. Amazon's doing voice on their new Fire, whatever that box is called. So I think the way that I would think about it is, where are the places someone's going to interact with you, and what do they have available to them? What's the most efficient way for them to get data in or out? Is it voice? Is it point and touch? Is it whatever?
So on the practical side of voice, what you have is you have a power management problem a little bit. And when you've got something as big as a cell phone, it's got a fairly sizable battery in it. And so you can kind of be waiting there with something that's semi-alive, meaning it's being pulse powered or whatever, it's kind of an ADD converter, waiting for that sound to happen. That takes power to do it. So the smaller the device, the less power you have, the less that voice becomes attracted from a, once again, kind of designed for physics, right? And so it's tough to put really voice commands into ultra small devices and have it power effective. And people are working on that problem a lot. I've seen some really good solutions starting to come out in the market, of which my company doesn't have one, so being honest here. But there are a number of companies that are being able to have a little bit of memory, be able to grab that voice, so you can do like an OK Google Now kind of feature in smaller devices and still do it at a power effective way.